Living through a pandemic with mass quarantines and lockdowns is a new and unnerving experience for all of us, but it has been a common one in human history. Even though science, medicine, technology, economics all change, there are far more constants than you might imagine. Most of all, the psychological experience of living through pandemic quarantine is remarkably similar in some respects across the centuries. Literature, and this is the main point of this course, cannot cure illness, but over the centuries, over the millenniums in fact, it has built up and recorded a set of strategies for psychic survival during a pandemic, which remain surprisingly relevant and useful today. So what are the psychological problems we face in quarantine? If you read plague literature over the centuries, what stands out most of all is the way in which being on lockdown changes your sense of time. We're used to thinking of the future as this big open space in front of us, a sort of empty, fertile field which we can sow with the seeds of our plans and ambitions and expectations. During a pandemic, however, the future is no longer an expanse opening in front of us. It becomes a kind of impenetrable thicket, like a little forest that we can't enter or see past. Our minds, when they're idle or daydreaming, naturally drift towards the future, whether in hope or fear or something in between. Once the future is out of bounds to the imagination, as it is now, we need to find somewhere else to send it. Something we don't notice when we're not in pandemic is the extent to which we're trained to think of ourselves in terms of ambition. Big ambitions, like what will I be when I grow up, to small ones, hosting a barbecue or organizing a vacation with a friend. When the future is cut off from us, we have to draw on something else for our sense of identity. When the future is no longer knowable or imaginable, we have to train our thoughts to go elsewhere. So related to our changed sense of time is the way in which a pandemic changes our sense of ourselves. Another key for our identity, another anchor for our identities is routine. With schools, workplaces, travel, social life, clubs, sport, all of those things either closed or suspended or uncertain, we're cut off from our routines, cut off from our habits. Plague literature teaches us that great knowledge can be gleaned from the interruption to routine and habit, but also that it's very challenging for our sense of self. Lastly, and perhaps most difficult of all, is the question of our connection to others. We usually enjoy the company of other people, but in a pandemic, we become threats to one another. Other people's bodies, especially, become objects of danger rather than desire. We start to build our life around avoiding them, crossing the street to get away from other passers-by, standing in line with 6 feet of distance, talking to each other on Zoom instead of in a bar. People become disembodied. Their bodies become things that frighten us rather than drawing us in. Contagious disease, this is to say, highlights the negative sense of being connected to other human beings. But our craving for connection to others never goes away. The text that I'm going to explore with you over the next 3 weeks, 2 pieces of prose fiction and 1 film, will look at all of these challenges. We'll see by reading them and watching them in the case of the film, that over time, literature has developed an app, you might say, for managing psychological life in pandemic quarantine. All of the works we're looking at address these problems. The future being closed off, our routines being interrupted, and our connection to other people being disturbed. Next week, we'll start by reading a classic work of plague literature, one that in fact Chaucer was partly imitating for the Canterbury Tales. We're going to read the introduction and first chapter of Giovanni Boccaccio's tale collection, the Decameron. This was written just after the Black Death had devastated Boccaccio's home city of Florence in 1348. We're going to read the beginning of the Decameron, which describes life in the midst of the pandemic that devastated Florence. And then we're going to look at the first story and look at the strategies for psychic survival that the Decameron offers.